Lamb. Melissa. When I was 9 in July 1973, I learned that all homes were not like mine. There was a certain amount of shame in that. I was at a friend's house, which was located about 3 blocks from my house. We lived in a small New England town, as you know, and so the elementary school was small, and there were not thousands of kids, but only 30 or so kids in my whole class. All the kids knew each other, and so did their parents. Most of the families with kids were extensions of families that had been in town generations before. Most of the family names were the same ones that had put down roots there before the Revolutionary War. I was at my friend Tanya's house, and I can remember standing in her living room waiting while she asked her mom in the kitchen if she'd come stay over at my house that evening. I was so excited because honestly, I could not remember a time before when anyone other than my cousins had come to stay over at my house. Most of my friends just always had me stay over at their houses. I stood there playing with the crochet tassels hanging over the arm of the couch in her living room. Her Grandma Stanley made crochet stuff, and I loved how it felt rolling between my fingers. It was summer, and her mom had closed all of the shades, so the house was cool and smelled like zucchini bread baking. It was taking a long time, so I sidled over to the door casing to listen to the conversation between Tanya and her mom, just out of sight. No, Tanya, you cannot go over and stay at Melissa's. But why? Come on, Mom. No, that's it. There are too many goings on over there. Daddy and I don't feel like it's safe. Melissa can stay over here if you want her to. And there it was, the goings on. At 9 years old, I had not really put words to what my home life was like. Goings on would be with me for the rest of my life as the best way to describe what home was like during my childhood. I knew that Tanya's house was different. I knew that the bulk of my friends' houses were very different. I could notice things, small things really, but they seemed to make all the difference for some reason. Like the absence of so many people who seemed not to have anywhere to live unless they were living on the floors, couches, or porch of our house. The absence of crazy in general. The smells and lack of garbage piling up and stinking in the garbage room. The absence of fear. Sometimes what you notice as a child is the absence of certain things in your friends' houses. Now, as an adult, I understand that there is no perfectly safe place to grow up, but there is certainly a wide swath of living styles that are somewhere in the middle. My home was not even close to that middle normal ground. And there, on that hot July day, with the smell of baking zucchini bread drifting into the room, I felt the burning, stinging edge of embarrassment and overwhelming shame. Shame is such a strange emotion. Shame will make you do and say things that are completely untrue. Shame will make you want to hide in full sight or remove yourself from the physical world buzzing around you at any given moment. Shame hit me on that day like a truck loaded with bricks. Shame made me run out of that house and up the street before Tanya even got out of that kitchen. Shame made me see in the eyes of the parents of so many of my friends a wishing, a regret, a silent, those poor kids. Shame was what propelled me to look at the floor when I was sent up to the corner grocery store with a list of items and not enough money. That wonderful lady at the counter always sent me home with all the items, but I knew it was out of pity that she did it. It was a hard, sour, poisonous taste in my 9-year-old mouth, and it took many, many years to finally spit that out. As I ran out of their yard on that day, I only had about half a mile to walk, and I would be in full view of my house. It was a Thursday evening, 6:45 in the hazy pink summer. I stopped before I got within sight of the house and sat down on the cement stairs of the survey building. I could hear Tanya's mom over and over in my head saying her words dangerous and goings on. I knew what she meant. I had never really put those words on my home life, but there I sat at 9 years old, alone, not wanting to go home, and knowing that there was a full evening of goings on getting fired up at my house even as I sat there. Guns, drugs, drunkenness, fighting, sex, constant debauchery, and general disorder were always the special of the day. The National Survey was the business that my grandfather owned. It was at the time one of the biggest employers in Chester. The national survey had been started by my grandfather's father, Lawton, and his brother Henry during the first part of the 19th century, and it grew to its most prolific state during the Second World War, doing top secret mapping for the United States government. The survey was just on the other side of School Street and ever present in our lives. My mother worked there her whole life, and I don't believe ever held another job. Sally did not ever hold a driver's license, and so walking across the street to her job was a good deal for her. Her world was very small, and she seemed to like it that way. At 9, I still loved my mother in some of the ways that young kids do, or I should say I was still trying hard to. Sitting there on the steps on the back side of the survey that afternoon, I could not make my stomach stop burning from shame. I did not know then, even, what shame was. Shame is, and quoted here from Webster's dictionary, a painful emotion caused by consciousness of guilt, shortcoming, or impropriety, and a condition of humiliation or disgrace. I could not have told you then on that hot summer evening what shame was, but it was nonetheless eating up my insides and clamping down my resolve. I felt guilty about my home. I knew on some level that to the rest of the general public, my home was not right. It was not even generally within the boundaries of what was considered safe and or good for children. Shame is a particularly acrid pill for a 9-year-old. I think it was then that I decided that if my mother and her lifestyle were going to make me feel this way, no one would ever see it. I would never let any person again see my shame. Shame is a very lonely world to live in for a kid. I would be something different. I would just not take it in. I was not her story. I was my own story. I would find out that the stories that we come from are not so easy to lay down or put away. Some stories will just keep coming back at you again and again until you decide to look at them, love them for what they gave you in lessons, and walk away peacefully. The peacefully part is the absolute hardest part to grasp. I certainly did not grasp that at 9, and as a grown woman, I still have to choose to grasp that lesson peacefully. There's nothing peaceful about shame. The other issue is that through our lifetimes and reincarnations, if shame is not addressed, we will keep piling up more and more diversionary issues in order to not look at it and peaceably release it. It is one of the most deep-seated and difficult lessons to work through. Shame would become a visceral part of my insides. My mother really liked men. She especially loved men who were much younger than her. This would have been of no consequence, really, except that some or most of them in the early days were barely, and sometimes not quite, above the legal age of consent. Often, after I had my own son, I would think back to those daddies, men, breadwinners, dudes, and feel literally and physically sick thinking of my son. What would I say to him if he came home at 17 and said, "Hey, I have found a mentally unstable, alcoholic, drug-addicted woman who has 2 small daughters, and I love her, and oh yeah, she's 32. I'm going to quit school, work full-time to support them. Don't worry, Mom, I got a full-time job. I'm super happy about it. I mean, I'm a senior next year anyway, right?" Even writing this now makes me feel just, shitty for those parents and sick to my stomach, and there were literally a few sets of them. I know that in the same situation, I would have put a stop to it for my very own son. I can't believe in retrospect that there were no charges filed, or at least an irate mother and father showing up with a shotgun to retrieve their young man from our home. Even as a 9, 12, or 14-year-old child, I knew that it was not right. I also knew that our house was a perpetual party, which made it all the worse because from the standpoint of a completely sober 9-year-old, they were there for the drugs, the freedom, and the lack of anything even resembling a normal environment, which would seem pretty shiny and amazing to the average 17 to 25-year-old male in 1975. For me, as a small kid, that made the shame and the heartbreak even more devastating because Sally would share with me her love life, her unabashed belief that this one really loves me, and it fed the shame. I wanted her to be happy, and I wanted her to be sane, but neither of those things was true, and it destroyed me inside. Even at 9, I felt 340 years old. I felt broken on the inside because I knew too much about her sex life. I knew too much about her addictions. I knew too much about her unstable mind. I actually knew that I had more sense and emotional stability than this woman who was my mother, and knowing that was terrifying. Perfectly and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, terrifying. The inmates were in control of the prison. The person least qualified was driving the bus. Terrifying. Aralamb on the subject of shame. Shame is a human emotional construct that was designed by the Creator God as a very specific tool by which a soul can make a direly needed correction. Shame in and of itself has nothing to do with the soul before the soul comes into a life. Shame is something that can be freely given from one soul to another when incarnate in the body. Shame can be bestowed upon a soul or person by a society, group, family group, or singular person, or even, but is usually incorporated by the soul itself. Shame, as you will see, is also completely avoidable as long as it is not attached to a particular event which the soul has perpetrated itself. If a soul, person, goes on a robbery spree, ends up in jail, and then joins a gang within the jail, and does nothing to address the actions, its repercussions on the soul's person upon which it has perpetrated, then shame is and will continue to reside within the soul's personal energy body for as long as it takes to come to the truth of its actions. By the same mechanism, at any point during this time, if the soul, person, begins to truly see, experience, and address the negativity of the behaviors and their effects on the souls perpetrated upon, then shame will begin to dissipate and be cleared. Interestingly, shame, unlike having a conscience, cannot be dislocated. Throughout human history, there have been those humans who are so dislocated from their souls that they seem to have no conscience. While it is true that a soul can dislocate from the energy form which humans would call the conscience to a very large degree, shame is a part of the Creator God's lesson toolbox that cannot be fully eradicated in a soul or person who is refusing to learn and grow in a positive direction. Shame will remain in the depths of even the most seemingly hardened criminal types of soul persons. These soul persons will deny having any kind of shame for their actions, but on the inside, the shame will reside as a constant reminder of a path negatively chosen. There is no escape from that kind of shame. Until the soul person addresses its actions, the shame remains. Shame is, on the other side of it, an emotional body which, with much inner truth-seeking, can be eradicated and released. Upon releasing shame, the soul or person can and will, without very much strife, begin to drop away the old stories, as Melissa calls them. As the old lesson stories begin to fall away, the soul person is freed from the shame. This change is exponential in nature and continues to build upon itself. Shame, which is closely linked with fear, anger, anxiety, jealousy, rage, and a myriad of other negative emotional states, is one of the main cogs in the progression of the soul upon earth. There are species which have advanced beyond the need to have shame as a tool of growth. Shame is a mechanism by which the soul can, as in Melissa's case, decide to extricate or change direction in order to put actual physical, emotional, and or spiritual distance between oneself and the object, person, or soul that is causing the painful physical and spiritual feelings of shame. Shame is a lesson on acceptance, judgment, release, and eventually love and peace. Once the decision has been made at any age to see and begin to distance the soul person emotionally from the object, person, or behavior that is causing the soul shame, the next step is acceptance. It is often very difficult for a soul to differentiate themselves from the person or situation that is causing the feelings of shame. If the shame is felt due to the activities of another soul who is close to you, that is, parent, loved one, partner, child, there is so much love mixed with the shame that for the soul to accept the situation for what it actually is can be painful at best and untenable emotionally at the worst. Even so, accepting intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually that the person or soul or situation is shameful Whether you are responsible or another is, must be truthfully addressed and accepted before the next step, judgment, can be attained. One cannot openly judge a situation until acceptance has fully happened, in a way by which the soul cannot slide back into denial or, in some cases, active participation in the relationship or activity which is causing the shame. The truth of the situation must be fully accepted by the soul. Judgment of where the shame is coming from is a necessary hurdle, and healing cannot happen until this step is taken. When I use the word judgment, I do not mean in the large sense of passing judgment. I simply mean that until a soul can openly judge where the shame is coming from and judge whether this shameful situation behavior is that of the soul or an outside soul or person, healing cannot happen. As a soul, you need to be able to judge without anger or hatred where the shame is coming from and who or what is causing it, even if you yourself are the cause. For example, if you were abused as a child, then the shame that you feel could come from that situation, and in order to heal from it, you will need to look and judge very honestly how much of the shame you feel from that situation is your own, and how much is actually due to the actions of your parents, or whoever the perpetrator of the abuse was. If you go on to abuse your own children, you will need to look at your own behavior toward them and see and judge honestly your own misdoings and judge the shame that you feel from your actions. Correct those actions, seek forgiveness, and change your behaviors immediately. Finding and judging the roots of your shame is the beginning of soul growth. Often, as Melissa described in her memory above, shame is held close to the soul, and the decision is made to hold that shame close and hard inside of the body in order to never feel that shame again. So many adult souls are holding childhood shame deep inside of them, and it colors everything in their life. The issue with this kind of protection tool is that the shame often comes from the actions or circumstances of those adults who were in charge of your upbringing. So, when judged very honestly and openly, that shame is not the child's at all. A child should not and cannot be held responsible for the actions of the parent or those around them. Because of this propensity for children to internalize and take full responsibility for the shame of the parents or other adults around them, they are literally taking on emotional lessons and hurdles that they themselves did not commit. A child who is sexually abused by a parent, adult, or family member usually carries the shame and responsibility for that within themselves into adulthood. From a completely energetic point of view, how can this responsibility be their own? Even if the child found some comfort, safety, or powerful sensation in that abusive situation, there should still be no shame for that child, as the care for that child's soul was firmly in the hands of the surrounding and/or abusing adult in the room. Moving into adulthood with this kind of victim shame is one of the most destructive and difficult lessons for a soul to see, learn from, release, incorporate, and overcome. The release of shame, however, is also one of the most vibrant and major milestones in growing the soul from lifetime to lifetime. For the soul of an adult to truly see all shame from childhood and release any responsibility for the idea that those around them were behaving in less than optimal ways, especially if the child was drawn into those same activities, it is the most powerful growth decision that a soul can make. The freedom that is gained from releasing unwarranted shame from the soul's past is immeasurable in nature. Once freed from the shame, which usually resides in the solar and root chakras of the human energy system, that soul body can naturally and will naturally begin to stand in the light of its own gifts, opportunities, and lifetimes without the shackles and filters of the unwarranted shame energy. Shame in the human energy field was initially implemented by the Creator God in order to be a satellite emotional trigger to fear, so that the early humans began to learn self-sentience and survival skills. As humanity moved forward in its evolution and was eventually seeded by off-world species, the shame emotion was diverted to a multi-level situation by the newly burgeoning brain synapses and began to play a larger and unintended role in human interaction. This is why shame can be felt at such a deep level by children for the actions of others. A child inherently knows when actions are socially or personally less than optimal for healthy survival. This is where the unintended shame can come fully into play. That child's brain does not have the ability to fully separate themselves evolutionarily from the shame that should be felt by the adults around them, and when not corrected by those adults, children will take that on themselves. It is simple, and yet once that shame is internalized and unchecked, it will go on to color those lives into adulthood and block the full joy of the journey that the soul incarnated to experience. If your shame stems from actual wrongdoings that you, the soul, perpetrated upon yourself or others, then you need to make full amends for those behaviors and actions immediately so that you can grow, release, and move forward. That would be the balanced and true performance of the tool of shame. Any other type of shame stemming from childhood is not and never was meant to be the spiritual hurdle that man has incorporated it with. From the standpoint of shame that is buried deep within us from our childhoods, adults do and will incorporate that shame being upon their own children without fail, unless they root it out from their own psyches. Shame of this kind must be put under the light of the soul and released in order to free subsequent generations from the burden of that internalized shame. Simply put, if you carry childhood shame within you, you will impart that to your own children in some way. You will need to release and heal that shame. You must feel it to do that in its entirety. Finally, it is imperative that any awakening soul determined to let go of any shame they are most likely holding within themselves from their own childhoods. Any perceived wrongdoing that was perpetrated to, by, or in front of a child or surrounding adults that caused the shame must be looked at, felt fully, and taken apart intellectually in order to be completely released. Once this occurs, the soul can move forward without the anchor of shame. There is no need to suffer from the tendrils of shame coloring your lifetime journey. As children, you are never guilty by association with your parents or the adults around you. You are not able to remove yourself, and the shame which should be felt by those adults should not be transferred to you. If you were made to steal toilet paper as a child by your parent in order to keep enough money for cigarettes, booze, and weed, that is not your burden to shoulder in any way of shame. You would have had the choice, you would have had no choice in the matter, and choice is the major issue with shame. As a soul grows into adulthood, the idea of choice becomes pivotal to shame, and who should take on its burden. If you find yourself at 16, 18, or 20 robbing a liquor store, that shame is your own and your own responsibility. To understand the difference in those two situations is the lesson. Melissa. As I became an adult and had my son at 21, I would look at him and wonder how I was even going to be acceptable as a mother in any way to him. I knew that I loved him in a way that literally made me second chair in my own life. Suddenly, there was something in the world that I loved more than me. I also knew that I had so much shame from my own childhood that was at that time not even fully finished. At 21, I was heading down a road that would ultimately be a probable carbon copy of the woman who I was at the same time so ashamed of, my own mother's life. I was on the path to repeating it with all of its emotional destruction, substance abuse, and maniacal uncertainty. I was looking into the mirror of my own childhood and all of its abuse and shame within the tiny face of my newly born son. One thought began to run through my mind, and it was this: I never want him to feel sick, dark, poisonous ball of emotion that was sitting at the very moment in my belly. I never wanted him to look upon me at 2, 4, 7, 9, or 16-year-old and hope against all odds that someone would not know that I was his mother. I did not want him to feel afraid that I was not mentally well enough to keep him loved, safe, fed, and clean. Looking down into his small, pink, perfect face on that day, it occurred to me that I did not want him ever to feel any misplaced shame because of me. I did not know how I was going to accomplish that, but I knew that my own shame was doing to me in my life, and I drew a hard line in the sand in order to stop my own shame from coloring his world in any way. I was going to try at least to make sure that he never ran from a friend's house in order to escape a tsunami-sized wave of shame that overtakes a child when they are isolated from their peer group because of the goings-on at home and all of the debauchery that is inherent in the statement. Hunter gave me the gift of at least seeing the problem with shame. Seeing the shame within for what it truly is more than half of the battle to begin the healing. Once you can see your shame sitting on the ledge of the gate to freedom deep inside you, like a coiling, hissing snake, you can surely begin to know that you need to get it up and out of you. Even if you don't know in the beginning how to get that painful, hissing thing up and out of your insides, you have seen it, and that is so much of the battle won. Once you know it's there inside you, it cannot be unseen, and you will begin to heal without fail.